Hello, people. Welcome to another edition of Friday Night Knives. This is a two-for tonight. We had the previous shootout, and now we have the Civivi. Am I right? Let's take a look at this thing. This is a Civivi, 8.5 inches from tip to tail, and from tip to scale, we're talking approximately 3.5, maybe slightly more. Tip to tail, 8.5, tip to scale, 3.5. All right, and this it's fairly classic. I really like it. It is Nitro V steel. Let's see if I can get that where you can see it. The Civivi puts it, if you can't see that right there, Nitro V. In what I would love to call a utility blade shape, but that really is kind of a reverse-tanto, I can't lie. It's got the double curve. It is a straight because it is sort of Warncliffe, but believe it or not, there's actually a slight belly to it, but it's pretty straight. There is just a slight bit of belly. It'll rock just a little bit. But that isn't too bad. You know, with that, let's get the weight on this thing. So we can take a look at these standardized references out of the way. It ain't light, right? It definitely has some skeletonizing. I don't know if you can see those in the light, but it has a tremendous amount of skeletonizing within the liners. It's just fairly large with a significant amount of steel. It is button lock, right? As well as flipper and tab. All of the deployment methods work great. Civivi's no slouch in that department. Let's get some of these more standardized or referentials. Spyderco Paramilitary 2. As you see, it's just about the same size. And honestly, without the beak, it has a little bit more hand space. If I put the choils together, there's a lot more hand space on the Am I Right? And the Para 3 lightweight here. Want to take a quick sec while I have these out to mention the height of this blade is equivalent to each. So these full flat grinds, at the highest point, the Am I Right is at least the same height, if not just slightly more, which is going to lend itself to a significantly good geometry. Those are fairly tall bladed or tall grinds on those, so that's why I wanted to make sure and use that. And of course, it's just a blur. As you can see, slightly smaller hand space that's fairly equivalent to the full-size handle, and not just any leak, but a random leak. Again, decent hand space. The leak actually is about as big as the full hand space without the choil on the Am I Right? Which is significant. There's a lot of hand space for larger hands or people who just like to move around in their grip. This is pretty significant. And the Benchmade bug out, as you can see, is significantly larger. And the Civivi Elementum, again, significantly larger. We're talking about hand space that really does kind of exceed expectations in a good way. And, you know, with the Civivi Elementum, it is just smaller in so many ways. And, of course, my Wienar. As you can see, it is larger than my Wienar, but my Wienar is better shaped. All right. Let's do the blade stuff, because this is actually very much worth doing on Civivi's, because they really do have a well-earned reputation. 113.5 thousandths. 113 thousandths. That's still a little. There it is. 1.125. That's pretty good. Behind the edge, which is ridiculously thin, I can tell you right now, just like so many Civivis. No, that's just off. Because I would love it to be under 12. I think it's right at about 12. Ooh. You know what? I'm going to try this a different way. Different directional so I can see it better. Oh, that slipped off. We are looking at between 10 and 12 thousandths. I'm just going to tell you right now. I've tried to measure this a couple times. 12 thousandths behind the edge. Ridiculously slim behind the edge with such a tall grind. Relatively slim. It's not super slim. It's under 1/8 of an inch. just barely. Slightly more, or just, it's right around 3 millimeters, or a polished 3 millimeters. You can see some of the grind lines on there. It's definitely polished, so it's approximately 3 millimeters. And with that tall of a grind, I mean, seriously, this blade, almost 1.5 inches at the base. If I were to do it at the very, very base, it's talking 1.5 inches. That's incredible geometry, right? 1.5, blah, 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 blah. The geometry on this is ridiculously slim, okay? So, and that lends itself to, it's not the smoothest because it's factory grind, but it's so slicey. And the Nitro V steel, decent edge retention for what it is, incredible toughness, which really helps that thin behind the edge part. I want to say that was visible, but no wonder that's having trouble. That's not the edge. That's doubled up. If it wasn't so shaky, I'd be able to do it better. But yeah, I hope you guys can understand that is very slicey, incredibly thin behind the edge, a very, very tall grind, nice polishing. As you can see, it is vertical on there, but it's very well done. You can see, wipe off some of my fingerprints from touching it. But you can see it's definitely got some cool stuff there. And that's really want to go on part of the design, right? The damn nice parts. The design is really good. That utility style blade and kind of the reverse-tanto frame or form is incredibly useful. This is an EDC beast. The ergonomics on it, you can choke up in so many different ways. It's really even, what it doesn't do is give you you have to choke back to get significant clearance, but doing something like the scoring cuts, very, very, very useful on this. Again, ergonomics, simple but classic and elegant. It has that arc. It has some jimping where your thumb goes in the saber grip. And this is the kind of blade you can really bear down on. You can also choke up to get it, if you need to get it closer somewhere in there. The ability to go all the way out to just the tip. Also very well done. Probably one of the only concerns I don't like about the design is that tallness, that height. In fact, just to give you an idea, I'm going to do this backwards. It is as tall at the highest point as the Paramilitary 2, which is a fairly tall. A lot of people don't complain about it because it's really 1 point, and that's kind of the point I have here. It's 1 point on the Paramilitary 2, and it slides down. This is a huge amount of steel that is hanging out there for something that's otherwise relatively slim. And it's only up there because they put the spacer to really make sure that the lanyard tube is right out here at the corner, the lanyard post. If this were flipped around so that these just screwed into the liners and the post was up here and where that spacer was the lanyard, this would go down half that gap as much again, right? If you guys can't see that, I'll show you. That is approximately about how much it would go down. It would almost sink entirely into the handle. That's my one complaint about the design, is that high point on the back here. It makes it look like a Milwaukee flipping utility knife. It has that really tall, it's not that it's so bad, it's in your pocket. It just, there's no way for it to really be slim in the pocket. And especially at this kind of weight, you know, over 4.5 ounces. It's not the heaviest knife out there, but it is definitely not the lightest. And it could be very useful in that. So that's one of the things. The aesthetics on this, I love it. This thing looks like a utility knife. It looks knifey, but it looks like a tool more than a stabby pokey thingy. Right? There's let's see, what can I, something like this looks more knifey and for some reason looks more dangerous. We don't want to talk about things like snap cuts or anything like that because really I think most people know that on a snap cut, something like this blade shape is far more dangerous. But that's beside the point, because really that's what this is. This is EDC. This is a utility. You know, I'm not going to argue with him in this. Definitely reverse tanto, but if you put a utility blade up here, it's going to be very similar. This is thicker steel. It's not as tough, but it will hold a, you know, Nitro V is not as tough as AEBL, which is what a lot of those blades are. But it is definitely a higher edge retention. So, you know, you get some trade-offs. The mechanics of it, it's really like that is drop shut. It's a guillotine. I mean, that baby is coming down. There's no blade lock. Right? No blade play in any shape or form. That is well machined, and tolerances are good. And every deployment works. Right? You can reverse flick the thumb studs. You can do the flipper tab. The button lock flip definitely works. It's a one-handed operation, pretty much whatever you do. And that's, I mean, it's not as controlled as some others, but this one definitely seems tuned for it, because, again, to bring out another Civivi button lock, with the lighter blade, it's somewhat more controllable. This is a much lighter blade. It's thinner blade stock, much smaller. It's a significantly lighter blade if it has Civivi's same mechanism. Maybe a little bit stronger spring, a little bit, but just the sheer weight of it distributed so far out away from the axis just gives it more of a drop shut feeling. You know, and that brings us kind of to the noteworthy points. The noteworthy points on this one is tied very much to what I think is its intended purpose. It's got this awesome utility blade, this reverse tanto utility style, sheep's foot, clipped sheep's foot, whatever you want to call it. I kind of like the utility blade style because that's really what it feels like. This feels like a utility blade. And it cuts like one, it works like one. If you're someone who's worked construction and you have a utility knife that you've used, this works very similar to a utility knife with a much longer blade. And that's actually really cool. It's incredibly useful as an EDC knife. The button lock is nice. The sort of gray blue G10 lends itself to a lot of customization. The matte gray clip doesn't shine as much. I love that they're doing this on a lot of the manufacturers are doing this matte brushed finish instead of a super shiny finish. Just to bring it, instead of a super shiny finish that's always going to catch the light and shine and all that stuff. I like the matte finish. I definitely like the matte finish. It works better with my clothes. It's not going to pull itself out. You know, again, I don't know about you guys. I don't own very many silver pants. That's just the way it goes. I just don't. Sorry, excuse me. So, you know, it's nice that they do that. And that's, you know, the intended purpose goes right with it. The design aesthetics really aim itself towards a purpose, which I like. I like that when you look at this, you know what this knife is for, right? This is an EDC utility knife that's got tough steel, a really high grind, so it's going to be super slicey. This thing is absolutely a package piercer, right? That is a fairly acute tip right there, with a lot of metal behind it and above it. So it's got a tough tip, tough edge, and it'll do that package. The shrink wrap or bubble wrap slicer, absolutely. You can get way up on this thing and really control how that is going through that hard plastic on some of those clamshells and shrink wraps. It is absolutely a cardboard carver, that high grind, tough steel, decent edge retention, and just long, smooth, flat grind like that will just tear through cardboard. This thing will demolish boxes with the quickness. And it is, of course, an envelope eviscerator extraordinaire. In the backhand grip like this, you can absolutely get that tip up into an envelope and open it quite nicely. So that's got some beauty to it. You know, it's really hard to ignore that there's an elegance to this design. Its intended purpose is integrated into aesthetics, design. The mechanics are well executed. And the noteworthy points really is that the intended purpose, design, and aesthetics all converge to let you know what this knife is about. And that's fantastic. The only other thing I can say is probably, Let me see if I can't make sure I get the cost right on this. I've been called out a couple of times now. Sorry about this. I should have made sure I did this beforehand. But it's in the relatively inexpensive things, right? So we're talking about something that's going to be around 75 bucks. It's not super cheap. This is a fairly big knife. It's got decent stuff. The steel doesn't really lend itself to that kind of cost, but with the type of inflation and, quite honestly, excessive profits, it's not a conspiracy. It's just a bunch of people doing the same thing, knowing that there's a limited amount of competition out there. And if they're all trying to make their costs back at the expense of the consumer, so be it. That is the world we live in, where we have a limited amount of competition and they all can just use the same formulas to try and gouge the public without it being a conspiracy. Okay? So that's, again, this is not just the knife. This is a lot of different market things. This isn't a conspiracy. This is business. But the cost to value ratio on it is pretty good. There are other ones out there that are cheaper. You know, as I have brought out the Cubit a few times, it's smaller and all that stuff, but it's similar in price. So in a way, you get a lot more money, or a lot more knife for the money, I should say. But then you've got other ones out there that are fairly good or smaller that are significantly cheaper. You're looking at like 20 something bucks. Range, that 50 to 75 or 50 to $80 range, even 60 to 80, is just that little bit of tier up from those 40 to $60 knives. But you don't always get significantly more, right? So there is, there's arguments to be made. If you need the larger knife, this thing is awesome, right? This is full size. Let me see if I can't bring out the Fantara. It's actually one that reminds me very much of the Sencut Fantara. See if I can do this here. Its height is approximately the same on the grind at the highest point. So you got about 1.5 inches. It's approximately the same blade stock. It is a very large knife, and this may even have, it has more hand space than the Fantara, as you can see. Even without the choil, the beak just limits it, and this just has more hand space, right? And it has more hand space, and it has a significantly larger choil. And the Fantara is a big knife, but the Am I Right has more space for a bigger hand. So that's really that's the other thing. It's not that it's specifically, but if you're someone who has more than slightly larger than average hands, Mr. Anderson, then this really can be a knife that will do it for you. Like, I have a whole nother finger on the end of that. I can spread out my fingers fairly significant. And if you have such large hands, if you're Shaq style, where you can put your, this is still maybe not a 4, you may need that choil. This will do it for you. You don't have to have the super duper huge, but yeah, if you have slightly larger, or you got the sausage fingers, this has it for you. You don't really need to worry too much about it. But the cost to value ratio, while good, isn't as good as some other offerings, unless you're one of those people who just, those smaller knives won't work it for you. You don't like them, whatever your reason to not. This is one of those knives that it's heavier, more substantial, it's larger. All of those things come into play. And the Nitro V is nice, but this is also one of those knives that would lend itself to any other fairly tough. S35 Yen first comes to mind. CPM 154 also comes to mind. Something else that comes to mind that would be nice, of course, Magna Cut. What knife isn't great with Magna Cut? It's a matter of cost. CPM M4. The one that really gets me, though, is something like CPM 154 that you could get a really good heat treat out of. I like 14C28N and stuff, but again, you would be looking at more expensive. This could have been 14C28N for my concern, right? This definitely could have been to try and get some of that cost down. Not that it necessarily would have. There's also the AR RPM9, which Civivi doesn't do, but there is that option that would have been fairly decent as well for a lower price. But you could put other steel in there, but there's really nothing wrong with the Nitro V. It's not my favorite steel, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's approximately similar to 14C28N. The edge retention is arguably slightly less with a slightly higher toughness. But really that, that lends itself to push cuts more than slicing cuts. It also means that this tip is going to be fairly tough when going, but it's also going to wear out quick. This, to me, is going to wear out faster at the tips simply because of the type of use you're going to have, which is going to start producing a slight curve, or you're just going to slowly grind this up. Either way, it is less of an issue. But that's really, the expectations I have of this thing were good. I loved the look of the blade. I expected it to be a decent utility cutter. It actually exceeded the thinness behind the edge, the high flat grind, the relatively slim blade stock, the guillotine drop shut action. Oops. Very, very nice. The button lock doesn't, like, I have to roll my finger on it to disengage. There's not a lot of safety issues. It works good on the left hand too without any issues. If you're up in there, your finger's not going to, run it off. So yeah, with a reversible pocket clip, it can be used for lefties, and though it is right hand bias, in some ways having that button on that side makes it a little bit easier than having your thumb roll on it as you have just one finger, as opposed to the bigger part of your pointer finger rolling over it and not being able to engage it. So the safety margin is pretty good. There's really not a lot to request without really changing something like the cost to value ratio or how it performs. So like I said, the ones that really come to mind are something like CPM 154 or S35 yen, where you could get a fairly decent amount of toughness with significantly higher edge retention. But again, will you have a heavier knife? Will it be more expensive? Could it have had nested liners to reduce a little bit of that extra steel in there, but then it would be lighter? I honestly don't have a lot of requests. I like the knife as it is. I'm always, knife steel nerd. New steels would be great, but it doesn't need them. And so that's where I'm going to this isn't my favorite knife, but this is such a utility cutter that it's just hard to even be upset with it. It's very, very useful. This has become incredibly useful in pruning. I have used it to take out some dragon fruit branches, cut down some of my pepper plants. This thing's really good. It just has that kind of use. To be perfectly honest, the one that I tried to use it for that, the one that I use the most for that is this reverse-tanto from Rick. Which is honestly, well, I'll bring that. I use this knife more than I ever thought I would. This is Reek right here, and that's actually going to be the topic of a video coming up soon, is knives that I use more than I thought. But that being said, the Amirite, I'm going to give it a 90 to 92. Depending on how you look at it, not because of any failings, but just it's honestly because of that slightly lower cost to value ratio at the $75 to $80 range. There's lots of other knives out there that are just as good. They have different niches, they have different purpose and all that sort of stuff. But again, there's other knives out there that are just slightly less expensive that can do a lot of the same stuff. That have a lot of similar capabilities, but are just that little bit cheaper. I actually don't remember if the artisan cutlery is slightly cheaper, but it is still nice. The Fontara definitely is cheaper. There's lots of that stuff that comes along. So yeah, and honestly, there's other Civivi options that are arguably more stylish and all that sort of stuff that do a lot of the same things. Right? The Sentinel Strike, arguably more stylish, lighter, same button lock capability, slimmer in the hand, slimmer in the closed, similar price. So that's probably the biggest reason I would say that this thing doesn't get a higher score. It may even be slightly lower. That price to value ratio or cost to value ratio really kind of brings it down a little bit. It is niche though. That is a subjective thing. For me, it doesn't do a lot more in my EDC. I don't need the extra hand space. I have large hands in width, medium in length. So yeah, it doesn't really do much for me to make it a better value. That doesn't mean it wouldn't for another user, which is something I really wanted to bring up. I don't have large hands. I don't use a lot of large knives because I don't need them. They weigh down my pants, generally speaking. But for someone who does, for someone who can't, who things like the Cubit are a 3-fingered blade, right? It's or a 3.5. For those kind of people, this is fantastic, right? Again, there's others, but that doesn't mean that this isn't great. So yeah, there's that. And, you know, I'm going to leave it there. You know, the design, the utility design is great, along with the aesthetics. It looks good. The mechanics are top-notch. Civivi, Sandcut, and we execute great. The noteworthy points is essentially the integrity of its entire design. It is designed to be a working knife, a good EDC utility blade. And it does that well. That's its intended purpose. It does it well. It has a slightly high cost to value ratio because there's other knives out there that do the same thing for approximately with approximately the same steel for a slightly cheaper price, or that have more value at approximately the same price, right? Within their own family of knives. So that kind of brings it down. And of course, the expectations were that it was going to be good, and it is fantastic. So it definitely excels in certain areas, and it's just kind of meh in others. And that's the Civivi, am I right? And you know, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Trying to keep it short for everyone, but you know what? I'm just going to leave it as it is. So you guys go ahead, take this video, watch it twice, comment as much as you like, be mindful of side effects. Remember to like and subscribe. This has been your dose of Drew. I am said Drew. You guys have a great rest of your night.